Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Enlightenment in our continuing study of world civilizations. We've already seen the Renaissance that goes from the 1400s to the 1500s. Next, we come to the Enlightenment. That's going to pick up in the 1600s and go into the 1700s. Notice I'm painting with a very broad brush. With the Renaissance, they looked back to the Greek and Roman classics. That was bypassing what they called the Dark Ages to look back and have a rebirth of that earlier time. With the Enlightenment, they look instead to science and philosophy as their authorities. With the Renaissance, there was an underlying Christian presupposition. With the Enlightenment, there is a tendency toward deism. We'll have Christians, but we'll also have atheists. And of course, deism, we'll talk about that in a bit. This view that God is the clockmaker that created everything, but then let it go and continue on its own. With the Renaissance, that had started largely in Italy, although eventually we have a Northern Renaissance as well. With the Enlightenment, we have its beginning really in France. With the Renaissance, you have a presupposition of the divine right of kings, and that continues throughout. But when we come to the Enlightenment, there is an emphasis on the rights of man, which will be diametrically opposed, doesn't have to be, but we're going to eventually see that in contrast to the right of kings. And that means that the Renaissance gives way to the Reformation, whereas the Enlightenment will ultimately give way to the age of revolution. We see this in Peter the Great, not revolution, but in the case where Russia had been considered sort of a backwards nation, a backwards area. He founds St. Petersburg, named after himself, of course, which becomes the capital of Russia, but also a gateway to Europe. If you're in St. Petersburg, you can actually take a ship to the northern Europe, to countries like Germany and Denmark, and just continue on around and come eventually to France and England. He sought to westernize Russia, where this gateway would bring in Western influence and Enlightenment ideas into Russia. For example, the nobles were called upon to adopt Western clothes and to shave their very long, bushy beards that were distinctive to Russian culture. Ballet and art were introduced. The University of St. Petersburg was founded, and he made an attempt to change the marriage practices. Back in his day, there had been arranged marriages. He had actually been in one of them. But now to move away from that, where marriage could be between two people who actually liked and maybe even loved each other. Now, I want to look especially at art and the Enlightenment. Among the Roman Catholics, they have embraced many art forms which are going to give rise, and we'll look at it in a moment, to the Baroque style. As the Reformation had come to Germany among the Lutherans, they had utilized some of those art forms within the church, as opposed to the Calvinists and other Reformed folks who had rejected religious art as being idolatrous in Christian worship. They didn't all reject art of any form, but they excluded it from the church. And this leads to increasingly secular subjects in the area of art. Now, I'm not going to look at those. What we're going to look at some of the Christian art of the period, but not necessarily art that you're going to find in the church. Here's an example. It's the Call of St. Matthew. This is the Baroque, and I want you to notice, first of all, the drama. It almost looks like the picture is stop action, and you can see them having moved, pointing in different directions, causes your eye to flow. Very rich in color, and there's an intense light, but also deep shadows that are in evidence. A second painting is seen in the Crown of Thorns. Notice that Jesus is pictured here, and there are those around him who are torturing him as he prepares to go to the cross. But notice in the way he looks, there's no halo around his head, nothing that you would consider from actually looking at the picture to note that he's any different from any other person. Notice also, this is sort of a side point, that the soldier to the left is in European costume, very European armor. That's not the armor of the Romans, neither is his hat that from the Roman Empire. The incredulity of St. Thomas, Caravaggio. And notice again, this is a picture where Thomas looks and sees Jesus, and Jesus says, look, take your hand and put it into my side. But notice the shadows, notice the expressions, the emotions that are captured in this painting. And then finally, we look at a different painting, the entry of animals into Noah's Ark. Notice you see all the animals, you see somebody guiding them. There's no picture of the ark itself. This is really a focus instead upon nature. Now, what I'd like to do is contrast Renaissance art versus the Baroque art of this new period. In Renaissance art, that had introduced perspective, but had failed to capture emotions. Those that you would see, they would be there, and sometimes you did see the perspective, but you didn't see the high intensity of emotions that are now seen, the drama and the emotional impact that comes to light in the Baroque art. In Renaissance art, it was all about order and rationalism and nature and symmetry. And those things don't go away for Baroque art, but now we see an emphasis on the emotional, the ornate, the dramatic, the dynamic. You can almost see the movement, and the asymmetric, that is, the main figure will not be just placed in the center of the painting, but sometimes off to the side. We still use this in photography today. Those forms are still with us today for high impact. Renaissance art, think about Michelangelo's David, and then compare that to this later portrait of David, where you can see he has just thrown the stone at Goliath. He's in motion as opposed to just standing there waiting, very calmly. One captures the form, the other captures the emotion. Here in this portrait of Madonna and Child, notice the difference. Both capturing the same topic, but notice in a very different way. The child isn't just stylized; you can actually see the baby, and they are up close, and you can see the emotion that is captured of the love for mother and child. A scene from the Renaissance art of Jesus upon the cross. Notice how everything's very centrally located, and they are pictured, one looking down, one looking up. And now with Baroque art, Jesus being brought down from the cross, and you can again see the flow of movement as he is being brought down. Here we have the disciples on after being on the Emmaus Road, and of course Jesus is telling them. And notice the forms are there. You can see the people. Notice the halos. You can tell who's involved, but not much movement. And then by contrast, here is Jesus explaining to those disciples. And notice the people are still there, but you can see the emotion. The action is caught almost mid-action as Jesus is breaking the bread and serving the wine, and suddenly they're astounded. Now, how did this impact Christianity, the Enlightenment and Christianity? Well, first of all, the area of deism. Remember, we described deism as that view that says there is a God, or at least a force, some sort of intelligent designer who has created the universe as though it were a grand machine and has let the thing into orbit swing, and there it goes and continues even to this day. But that is very anti-supernatural with regard not to the origins of the universe, but to the question of, does God still act? You see, deism says, yes, God created, but that's all he has to do with our world, and our world ever since then operates like a machine that once created then continues to run. It is a bit like looking at a pocket watch. That pocket watch had a designer. It's a device with very intricate mechanisms. Didn't come about by chance. But once having been created, it continues to run like a machine, whether anybody is there to see it or not. And this was the impact of the Enlightenment upon Christianity. We also see the advent of biblical criticism as people began to look at the Bible and to ask the question, well, how did this come about? If I reject the supernatural, if I reject that God is continually involved in answering prayer and in doing miracles, then how am I going to explain those things to the Bible? And very often it came about with an attempt to sort of downplay those ideas. In fact, we're going to see Thomas Jefferson, who wrote his own version of the Bible in which he cut out all the parts he didn't like. He cut out all the parts that contained miracles and prophecies and things like that. And what he was left with was a book that had some nice sayings and nice stories and perhaps some teachings on how we ought to live. Not that he necessarily observed those.